Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Outside Story Halloween Special 2021. This is episode 3, and today we'll be talking about high school horror. And the two films we've chosen, or rather, the film and limited series that we've chosen to talk about, are The Shed and Fear Street. For our first film, The Shed follows this high schooler named Stan, who is kind of a dork slash nerd. No, not really a nerd. More of just kind of like a dork. He's, a quote unquote loser. And he has this thing happen to him. Essentially, something is taken the shed in the back of his house and used it as sort of a home or like a hideaway. And he is pretty scared and doesn't know what's going on. And it sort of kind of follows him and his journey for his own life, coming to terms with a lot of things. For example, him being a victim of bullying, and also sort of his own life as both of his parents have died. And it just kind of follows his sort of journey. It's a little slice of life, wouldn't you say, Larry?
Yeah, I would definitely say The Shed is definitely a slice of life. And it's much slower than most other horror films. Like, literally, the first 30 minutes does a lot of setup, I would say. Like, does a lot of setup with the main character. And even, like, the next scene after he goes to school is him hanging out with his friend, him ditching school. Like, we don't really have to see all of that. But the director just kind of takes us on this, little peek into the main character's life. Into Stan's life, about just kind of like what he experiences at home. He lives with an abusive family member. He gets bullied all the time. He has a crush on this one person at school. All these sorts of things we get to see all little bits and pieces of it and how they all play throughout the entire film. So yeah, definitely like a slice of life horror kind of film.
This film takes place in a sort of small town, rural sort of in the middle of nowhere cornfield sort of setting.
Yeah.
And so like it's interesting because you kind of get to know the character and you're like, man, his school's pretty small, or like there's not that many people in his town and stuff like that, which kind of adds to this sort of small town feel, which I actually really really like about the film.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and so I kind of came across this film. I don't even remember when I came across this film, but it had been on my list for a while, and I thought it was pretty interesting because it's not really much of a spoiler, because in the very, very first opening scene, we're told that it's a vampire flick. And so, this is a vampire film, again, similar to Midnight Mass. Oh, that was a spoiler, I guess. Oops. So if you haven't watched Midnight Mass, spoiler, it's a vampire flick. But yeah, so this is a vampire flick. A vampire actually takes over Stan's shed in his backyard and kind of uses it as like a place to hide. And Stan sort of comes to terms with like the vampire in his shed. At the same time, the events surrounding the vampire in his shed also push him to think about his own life, and the loss of his parents when he was a child, and all these other things, because basically shit's going down, and it's going down really quickly. And my first thoughts on it, I actually really enjoyed it more than I thought I would. So those are kind of my first impressions. And
yeah, I also really liked it as well. I definitely, though, do think it had a lot of missed potential. Like, there's a lot of setup for so many things, and I absolutely love the setup. But I just felt like it didn't use all of its setup to pay things off, especially towards like the climax and the end.
Right.
But it is definitely still a very good climax. I think it definitely touches upon a lot of the themes about like also what the character is kind of thinking about, and he's not really sure what he wants to do, but also like what this power, what having this monster in your shed, like what it means to other people too. Some people just want to get rid of it. Some people are just like, what the heck, stay away from it. Some people want to take advantage of it, because they're sick of and tired of being pushed around. So all these sorts of things where it's like the characters in this story, they take upon it in different ways. So that's what I really liked about it.
I would agree with you on that, in that the third act kind of falls a little short for me, some random things kind of happen, and then characters who weren't really part of the story kind of end up being a part of the story all of a sudden, and
Right,
so
right.
it feels a little awkward. And like I kind of wish that, honestly, we got more of the main character. It's like we get a pretty good amount of him, but like I feel like he needs a lot of help from his supporting characters to like get to kind of where he is. But I personally love him as a main character, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
wish that that there was a little bit more transformation sort of on his end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, would you recommend it?
Would I recommend this film? I think I would recommend it. It's a pretty like cut and dry, and not in a boring way, but like it feels a little sort of typical to me of like a high school style sort of horror flick. It feels a little slasher-y, because there is a little bit of gore and blood here and there. I personally think that if you want to watch an indie flick, then this is a good pick for a sort of horror indie flick. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would definitely agree. It's definitely indie. It's not a bad thing. Like I love indie films. And indie horror films on top of that, that's where everyone starts when it comes to, establishing their horror identity, I guess you can say. And yeah, I'd say The Shed is definitely it's definitely a good watch. I'd recommend it if you're in the mood for, like Jonathan says, some indie horror flicks, some indie horror films. And yeah, if you want something more grounded, I guess, something more like you understand where the story's gonna go from point A to B, but you're not really entirely sure how it's gonna end. That sort of story. This is that kind of story. So yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, that's our thoughts for The Shed. And so our next sort of medium, I don't know what to call it.
Yeah, it's so hard. It's so hard to
concept,
classify. Yeah, because it's not a film; it's a trilogy.
Right,
Yeah.
right. It's kind of like a limited series, kind of. It's
Yeah.
a 3-part film series on Netflix called Fear Street. Originally, Fear Street was written by R.L. Stine, and so I think it's loosely based off of sort of the R.L. Stine's Fear Street books. I don't know how much of it has to do with the original material or anything like that, but this Fear Street on Netflix follows a young woman named Dina who is part of a town called Shadyside. And Shadyside is right next to another town. I don't remember what the other town's called. Do you remember?
No, I don't.
It's next to this other town who is like the very, very opposite of Shadyside. Okay, so Shadyside is like where the poorer folks live, and like bad stuff happens, and it's like it's what it sounds like. It's the shady side. You know what I mean?
Shadyside
and
and Sunnyvale.
Sunnyvale is like a town literally right next to Shadyside, where everything is great, everything is happy, everything is good, and rich people live there, and et cetera, et cetera. And so Dina, who lives in Shadyside, she's sort of going through this personal thing with herself and her ex, and one of the things that just happened in Shadyside that continues to happen is that there was this murder that happened. And when this murder happens, they realize that they're sort of caught up in the middle of it, Dina and her group of friends. And as they sort of get caught up into it, Dina's ex also gets caught up into it. And they essentially go on this journey to sort of save her ex from succumbing to the curse of Shadyside. Again, this was one of those Netflix like recommendations, you know what I mean? And I also think, Fear Street was pretty big and was recommended for a lot of folks, because I think Fear Street was on top 10 Netflix for quite a while when, it started coming out. The first film, I think, is the best one out of all three. And I personally really, really enjoyed it a lot more than I thought I was going to enjoy it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. If anything, Fear Street Part 1 and the last half of Part 3, combine all of those, and I think you'd have an amazing story.
But as I was thinking, like I was watching Part 2, like rewatching it in the background earlier today, and I actually enjoyed Part 2 also. That's the summer camp one.
Right.
And I actually like the sort of, like, when it comes to high school horror, right? Like there's like different sort of settings you can take, and summer camp for high school stuff is like kind of like a one of those themes and one of those things, like where it's just like summer camp. You kind of see it in Camp Rock, for example, in
Mm-hmm.
Disney Channel, and then you see it in High School Musical. Well, I guess they weren't at a summer camp, but there was like a summer sort
Mm-hmm.
of thing for High School Musical too. And so, like, to see Fear Street, like a high school horror flick, sort of take that summer camp vibe, I actually really, really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then part three was kind of like, I don't know, part three, the beginning half of part three, like the first half of it,
Yeah.
just kind of dragged a little bit for me.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, part three for some reason, I don't know, like it wasn't bad that they explained everything, right? But at the same time, it's sort of like I
Yeah.
don't care that much
Yeah.
because
It
I
kind
look because the problem is I already love all the other characters. You know what I
Right.
mean? I
Right.
love all the other characters.
Right.
Okay, absolutely. Like that's why Jonathan and I love part one. Like part one so much because they do such a great job at like making you love all of the freaking characters, like
Uh-huh.
all the main characters in part one. And so even when you see them again in part three, it's sort of like, when it's still them, but it's not them in part three. You know what I mean? It's the
Right. It's the
second half where it's
actors. Right.
actually, yeah, it's the actors in part three, but it's not really them. They're just kind of there to kind of, I guess, help Dina understand the story a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. You know?
Right.
Um,
Right. It felt kind of like a lore dump, you know?
yeah.
Like part three, like the beginning half felt very much like a lore dump. Like, oh, this is happening because of all this, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
happened in the past. And so, you know, I guess, you know, and also like
Yeah.
you had spoken a little bit when we were watching it, like you didn't really love the theme, right? Of
Yeah.
like the 1600s and stuff.
Yeah, I don't really like that whole like Salem
The setting.
witch,
Yeah.
the Salem witch hunt setting, I guess you
Right.
could say.
Right.
It's just I personally just don't think it's a very interesting time period to talk about anything.
Right.
Like literally the only thing I know about that time period is witch hunts. Where people
Right.
just start accusing people of other things with no evidence. It's like when you play Mafia or Among Us without having any real evidence. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what watching this time period is like, and that's how the first half of part three is. I'm like, you know what? It's like this is the worst thing to watch because it's like because you just feel so helpless. Like, what can you do against someone's word, even if it's not true or not? You know?
Right. Right. They're
So
just
it's like,
accusing each other, and there. I guess you know that was a little bit a part of the theme too. You know, is like
yeah,
you know this sort of like women had no say. You know, and literally
mm-hmm.
like a drunk guy can point a finger, like a drunk man can point a finger at a woman and say that you know I saw her doing this, and they would take that drunk man's word over that woman's word. You know.
Right.
Because of how sexist sort of the culture and community was back then.
Yeah, so yeah, not a huge fan of that kind of time period and time setting. I just not a fan of it. But everything else I thought was really well done. So I guess we didn't really even talk about what they're trying to do, right? Even without all the parts, I guess you can say.
Yeah, we just kind of gave a more general sense, but you want to talk more details?
Yeah, just a little bit more detail because they're trying to so essentially Shady Side is like under a curse. I don't remember the girl's name. Nah, I should look it up. What
Sarah
is the
Fear.
Sarah Fear? There
She's
we
the
go.
witch. Yeah.
Yeah, so people believe Shady Side is under this curse, under the curse of Sarah Fear. Basically, where it's like she'll take possession of certain people and they'll just start committing like mass murder, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And these events would occur every so often, maybe every 10 or so years ish, around there.
Yeah.
There's no real specific number, but then there's a lot of like Shady Side has a lot of serial killings throughout the history since it's been established. And so people are blaming this woman named Sarah Fear. And so the whole film is basically this group of friends and they're trying to uncover and figure out why this is so and what they can do to stop it because they believe Dina's ex is going to be the next like killer, I guess, you know, to be possessed and start committing mass murder as well. And when obviously it's very 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 important to the character and we don't want that to happen. And also it goes deeper than that though too. It goes deeper to the point where it's like, it's about the people of Shady Side.
Mm-hmm.
It's about like the community and them overcoming like this,
Stereotype.
yeah, the stereotype, and also
Right.
this conflict that they have with Sunnyvale.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's like this film absolutely has so many undertones. Like,
Right.
you know,
And I
like
love
there's
that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Like this film is like brilliant because of that. Because like the plot is definitely them about trying to overcome the curse, but they say so much, you know, in every film, in
Mm-hmm.
each part of the trilogy, every film there's so many things that talk about class, your social status,
Mm-hmm.
your
Your gender.
race, your gender.
Uh-huh.
Like there's so many undertones, and it's kind of ridiculous how like brilliant this film is when it
Yeah.
comes to like
Right.
portraying those undertones. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah, that was one of the things I really loved about this film series was because they were able to do it tastefully, you know, without it being cheesy or like knocked over the head. Like I get it, you know, like it didn't feel like either of those things for me. You know, and they were able to just about say something about everything, you know.
Hmm.
And there's even a little bit of undertone about like teenage sexuality as well, you know,
Hmm.
which I
Yes.
very very much appreciated the sort of, you know, like nod that they had put towards that, you know.
Hmm.
um yeah.
But yeah, definitely like absolutely. If you haven't seen this trilogy, definitely check it out, especially if you love horror films, especially love slasher. Like Fear Street
Yeah.
is definitely, I believe Fear Street evolved has pushed forward the slasher genre, you know? You can tell a great story using the slasher genre, the horror genre. Because I'm always very biased against slashers, you know what I mean? We've talked about slashers before in our previous Halloween specials, and we've talked about how like a lot of slashers are just mainly trying to figure out, you know, who the killer is, or trying to stop the killer from doing stuff, and the killers are just killing just cuz they're killing. But this one definitely says a lot more than that. And so I think Fear Street has definitely pushed forward like what it means to tell a story in the lens of a slasher film. So
Yeah, I would agree that Fear Street is one of those, for me, it was really one of those really nice surprises, you know, that even though it sort of had all this big production behind it and all this sort of hype behind it, I was just kind of went in. I was kind of like, I don't know if this is actually going to be good. You know what I mean?
right.
But then went in actually being very surprised, like that I actually really liked the characters and the undertones were done very tastefully. And the overall story with the very, very end twist was actually a good twist. You know what I mean? It's like, oh
Mm-hmm.
yeah, cool. I mean, I maybe saw it coming, but I didn't see it coming until it was already coming at me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
so it was just one of those things where it's kind of like, oh, okay, I see. And I very enjoyed sort of the journey that the film series takes you up on. But you know, if you can't really do all three films, definitely watch the first one at least, because I
Mm-hmm.
think the first one is so worth your time. So worth your
Yeah.
time.
The problem with watching the first part is gonna make you watch the second part. So that's how we tricked you. Yeah, but yeah,
Right.
part one absolutely. Of all three, part one is the best. And once
Right.
you pick up part one, you probably won't be able to stop watching
Right.
this trilogy.
But
So
then at the same time, you won't be disappointed with part 2 and 3. You know,
mm-hmm.
I don't think you'll be disappointed because you'll know sort of the entire story of what's happening. And so
Mm-hmm.
maybe even that is worth, you know, sitting through parts 2 and 3. But for sure, part 1.
Mm-hmm. If anything, I have to like now that we're talking about like the other parts, part two actually had a really good like it did touch a little bit with like Dina and those characters, but part two was about the two sisters at the camp.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Yeah, and I thought that was really well done.
It was very well done. And at
Yeah.
the very end, like the very ending of the second part, it was very, what's the word? It was just very touching, you
Mm-hmm.
know, the end
Yeah.
of the second film.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
they managed to do it, and you don't need a whole entire trilogy to understand part two. You know, part two, like as a standalone film, part two could be its own standalone film. Like that's how strong it is on its own in terms of like how it tells its story. You know,
Mhm. Mhm.
and they all just happen to connect all three films. You know, within like under this umbrella that this is the story of Sarah Fier. So.
Yeah. I will just quickly add one last thing. Simon is probably my favorite character. and I'm sad about the fate of Simon in the first film. But you
Yeah,
know,
I actually really like Josh, the younger
the
brother.
brother, yeah, I really like Josh too.
Yeah,
I really like Josh too.
I mean, not just because he's a nerd and I kind of relate to it, but it's more like he still does what he can, for his
Hmm.
sister. He
Hmm.
has nothing to do with the entire, with the entire conflict, whatever. But he still puts his life on the line, for his
Right.
sister, for his
Hmm.
family, and that means a lot for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Hmm.
I definitely like that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the like other things I really really like about this is actually the main character Dina. She's a very very strong female character, and I'm really glad. I won't ruin the quote unquote surprise for her character's sort of like her own character's story for you, but definitely watch it as I'm very very excited to have a character like Dina just kind of be at the forefront of Fear Street, because I feel like characters like Dina don't necessarily get that much of a forefront. You know what I mean? They're
Mm-hmm.
usually in their own very particular type of films, or like they are side characters. You know what I mean? And so
Mm-hmm.
to have
Yeah.
Dina as kind of like the main character, I just really really enjoyed that as a just kind of like note for Fear Street.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so those are our thoughts on Fear Street. Again, it's available on Netflix. So if you have a Netflix subscription or you're sharing a Netflix subscription, which a lot of us do, go ahead and give that one a watch. Definitely, again, for the spooky season of October. Thanks again so much for joining us. This was episode 3, High School Horror. Next week, we'll be talking about the topic of friendship. The two films we'll be talking about are The Ritual, which is about a group of friends who go on a hiking journey in the middle of Sweden. Is it Sweden or Norway?
Europe. I would just go say
One
Europe.
of the creepy north countries of Europe, either Norway or Sweden. They go up there, which is absolutely beautiful, by the way. But let's just say it's creepy AF. And so they go hiking. It can all end well, right? And then the second film is a film called Coherence, about a group of friends who sort of get together on a night just to kind of hang out, and then some freaky stuff starts to happen to them. So hopefully you guys will either watch those in preparation for our talk, or just come and hang out even though you haven't watched the films, because it's going to be a good time. Again, thanks everybody. We'll see you next time.